Good Vibrations.
Well, we are getting heavy and topical for the time of year this episode. I've got a returning guest. He featured on Good Vibrations a while back. We were just talking about how long ago it was. I think it was sometime in 2018. And I've been a guest on his Secret Teaching show. We did a very memorable one last year that lasted for about 3 hours, which I think is the longest show I've done. And this guy does shows like that several times every week. So he is a wealth of knowledge and information. So welcome back to Good Vibrations to host of the Secret Teachings radio show, Ryan Gable.
I'm so happy to talk with you again, Mark. Thanks for having me.
No worries, man. We always have good conversations. And what inspired the show that I want to do today is one that I heard on your channel last year, which you titled The Secret Teachings of Christmas. And I really wanted to get some of that wisdom and knowledge that you put forth in that show shared with my audience here. So you were getting into the origins of this strange ritual that so many of us here in the so-called Western world go through every year, known as Christmas, and the reasons why we do the things that we do and where it all came from. So that was an incredible amount of research that went into that show last year. I mean, was that stuff that you had to specifically go digging for, or is it all information that had come across your radar one way or the other over a period of time?
Yeah, whether it's the origin of the holidays or holy days, as they are appropriately called, that's where the word holiday comes from, holy days, or it's the origin of the days of the week, or the icons of Christmas or Halloween or any holiday throughout the year around the world. We trace these origins back, and it's I think it's very simple to comprehend that the origins of these things obviously come from much older times. Sometimes we have traditions that are new, but they are inspired by much older traditions. And when you start to investigate, and that might just mean picking up a book and coming across something you never heard of before, you start to research things, you realize that obviously there are much older origins. It doesn't make the celebration a negative thing. It doesn't demean people's traditions. I just like to look at the origins, and so when I started looking at Christmas, and I really like looking at Halloween, Samhain, Samhain, as they call it, and I just started coming across all of these parallels, and whether it's Santa Claus or just the origin of the month December and where that comes from, because it was the 10th month of the year in Rome. That's why decade, December. So for me, it's fascinating to learn the origins. And the more that I learn about the origins, the more it makes sense why we have certain traditions, where they come from. And I think that gives us a better understanding in order to function in the world, as opposed to just simply blindly following traditions, not knowing where they come from. Some people disagree with me on that, Mark, but I like to know the origins. I like to know what I'm celebrating and why I'm celebrating it. It gives more meaning to it.
Sure. And most people, I feel, would give no thought whatsoever as to why it is they go through certain rituals this time every year. And they would deny that it is ritual. They would say, I don't take part in things like that. I'm just doing what everybody else does. Effectively what they've been conditioned by society to do. So people don't give any thought as to why it is you put a tree up inside your house and decorate it with gifts, why you give presents, why you give cards, why you kiss somebody under the mistletoe at the office Christmas party, why you have a turkey on your table if you are a meat eater, and all this kind of stuff. So it is all ritual. It all goes back to the ancient world. So isn't it amazing that we've been coerced as a society into taking part in all these activities with absolutely no comprehension of what it all signifies?
It is incredible, and just something as simple as the days of the week. Saturday and Sunday, named after Saturn Day, and then the day of the sun, Sunday. And it takes you all throughout the week, Monday, Moon Day, all the way to Frigga for Friday. And when you look at something like a ritual, you just define it quite simply as a religious ceremony, and it consists of a series of actions that are performed in a prescribed order. And we do that every year. We do it in a collective form. We do it in an individual form, in a familial form. After Halloween, what happens is we typically every year get a little bit closer from Halloween to Thanksgiving, and as soon as Thanksgiving's over, Thanksgiving's not even actually over yet. We've already got Black Friday, and then it takes us immediately into Christmas. And so that is a series of actions that we perform as a society, at least in Western civilization for the most part, and we do this every single year. We do it through the processes of economics, through, selling things like Black Friday and a Christmas shopping season. We do it with what we decorate our homes with. We make sure we get the Christmas lights out as soon as the turkey is put away in the refrigerator. All of that is ritual. The idea that a ritual is, the sacrificing of the firstborn or, sacrificing an animal, that is a ritual. It can be carried out as such, but a ritual is just doing something in a prescribed order over and over again. And we do that every single year. We do that every single week. That's what our jobs are. That's what our lives are. Our entire existence is ritual, Mark.
Yeah, good point. And Christmas, as it's been handed down to us, is a hodgepodge melting pot of different influences, most of them from the pagan world, it seems.
Yes.
And most of it from Northern Europe. So there's elements of the Winter Solstice, which I guess is the main core element of it, around which everything else is hung, because that's the 21st of December in what we call the Northern Hemisphere. So that's why Christmas occurs this time of year. What some Nordic European traditions refer to as Yule around that time of year. You've also got a Nordic belief system involving the god Odin or Woden, from which we get the word Wednesday, who I think used to have flying reindeer, according to the legend, which is where we get the idea of Father Christmas being pulled by his reindeer through the sky on his sleigh. Then you've got the Roman festival of Saturnalia and the celebration of the god Mithras. There's a Dutch figure known as Sinter Klaas, which is where we get Santa Claus. And there's other elements as well. So maybe we should start with the Winter Solstice, which is connected to solar worship, the sun. That would appear to be the one around which most of the other elements are hung. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, and I would suggest that for some people it might be the opposite. Some people look at other parts on the wheel of the year, if you will. Some people call it the witch's calendar. But the idea of pagan origins, that also tends to scare people. The word pagan simply means, in its original form, religion of the country people. So people that were in the countryside, pretty simple, and people that would, I wouldn't necessarily say worship, I guess it depends on how you define that word, but who honored nature, who observed nature. And by observing nature, observation is science, and through science was developed complex mythology so that we could understand nature, we could understand the changing of the seasons. And in order to become more in tune with the changing of the seasons, whether that's, weekly, monthly, yearly, or the 4 seasons in general, people would conduct certain rituals. And if you know anything about witchcraft, I'm not talking about witches levitating naked in a forest with the devil at a black mass, but if you look at witchcraft in the sense of just basic paganism, witches in particular, they celebrate the 4 minor sabbats, and then there are 4 major sabbats, and the 4 major sabbats are Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh. Now, for anybody who's never heard those before, I don't want this to be complicated and hard to understand. It basically looks like this. If you draw a cross, standard cross, on a piece of paper, in between the spokes of the cross, where you could draw basically an X, you have Samhain, which is the midpoint between the fall equinox and the winter solstice. You have Imbolc on the right side, which is the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. You have Beltane, which is the midpoint between the spring equinox and the summer solstice, and you have Lughnasadh, the midpoint between the summer solstice and the fall equinox. Those are the major sabbats. And then you have the minor sabbats, which are Litha, the summer solstice, Mabon, the fall equinox, Ostara, from which we get Easter, Eostra, Easter, Ishtar, and then that is the spring equinox, and then you have Yule, the winter solstice. So witches and people that consider themselves pagans, they do things in order with the changing of the seasons so that they can better understand them, so that they can become a part of them, so that they can comprehend, as far as I understand. I'm not a pagan or a witch, but as far as I understand, so they can understand and they can more come into tune with nature. And that is the origin of the origins of where we acquire a lot of these traditions. And I think you said mistletoe a second ago. If you look at something like mistletoe and holly are living forms of vegetation. And so during the winter months, when things die, of course, it's obviously a little bit different in the old world than it is today. We don't just go down to the store 1,000 years ago and get food. If you had a bad harvest, that's pretty scary. You might not have enough food. People are going to die if you don't have warmth, and you need those things. So these became extremely important elements that are the root basis of our traditions today. So things like mistletoe and holly are the living forms of vegetation that remind us that as long as we, perhaps are true to self and true to God, that, we'll have, a winter that will be mild, perhaps, or at least one we survive through the darkness, through the cold, through perhaps even potential starvation. We get through that, and then spring comes. Jesus returns, the days become longer, and things are warm again, or they start to get warm. So mistletoe and holly, for example, were brought inside of the home in a form of I call it vegetation veneration. They're venerating vegetation, remembering nature. And then you have, the Germanic tradition of bringing the Christmas tree, the pine tree inside, decorating it. There's a long tradition and origin there of that. But when you start to look at these things, you realize, well, this all makes a lot of sense. Obviously, if you're worried about darkness, cold, and maybe not having enough food, the whole entire wheel of the year, the winter solstice through the summer solstice, everything is based on the sun. It's based on fire. It's based on keeping things warm, keeping things safe and protected from darkness. And that might be personified, Mark, as evil spirits. We see that during Samhain. So we put out jack-o'-lanterns to ward those spirits off. But I learned this like 3 years ago. I thought this was really fascinating. For Christmas, the reason we decorate trees with little bulbs is because the bulb is very similar to the jack-o'-lantern. They call them witches' balls. This is a tradition from the 1600s, and the witches' ball supposedly would ward off witches, but it would also, just because the witch is a personification of evil in that case, it wards off evil, it wards off darkness. So light thus becomes the primary driving factor of every single one of the sabbats. Whether it's Yule, when the light is dimmed the most, we burn Yule logs, we have Christmas lights, or it's Litha, where we have big fires after Beltane, the summer solstice, to keep the fire alive like the Vestal Virgins in Rome did. Never let the fire die out, because that fire is life, and that fire is thus ascribed the qualities of a human being, and that of Jesus and his passage through the wheel of the year, or the sun's precession of the equinoxes, and so on and so forth. I guess to sum it up really, really precisely, it is as above, so below. That which is above is like that which is below, and we mimic below what is above, and that puts us in tune with these things. That's also natural magic.
I've just put out my allegorical The Cause and the Cure, and many of the character names in it are coded. So people can have a field day with trying to work out what the names mean and what they tell you about the character of the individual involved. And I've got a character in there called Sam Hain. Incidentally, he's a copper, Detective Sergeant Sam Hain. So that's one of many such names that people can have some fun with as an aside. Interestingly, all the customs that you're referring to here originate from what we refer to as the Northern Hemisphere. We don't get any of these from the South, where you have images of Australians having barbecues on the beach in 38-degree heat on the 25th of December. But the winter solstice and all these customs based around December all originate out of the Northern Hemisphere and is very much based in Northern Europe. And it seems to me that there's a lot of archetypes here that seem to be lodged into the collective psyche and built into the very DNA of Europeans and their descendants. And that, of course, will include a lot of Americans and Australians, actually, because of emigration that took place to various parts of the world. But in America now, you'll have a lot of descendants of Northern European settlers from previous generations. And it feels like all this stuff it means something to them. And it's like these archetypes are being awoken every year when we go through these customs and these rituals, because it ties back to like memories of previous times that are in the DNA of these people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like a genetic memory, right?
Exactly. Genetic is the word I was looking for. Yeah,
it's a genetic memory, and I agree with you. I don't know if it's even necessarily something that has to take place, in reference to old traditions 1,000, 2,000 years ago. I mean, we do things because our families did them, our parents did them, and that in and of itself is kind of like a genetic memory. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel comfortable. It makes us feel safe in the same way that 1,000 years ago, let's say, a big fire would be had during Beltane or the summer solstice to make sure that the sun doesn't burn out. It's not literal, it's just a symbolic gesture, but in order to protect themselves and to keep themselves warm symbolically and literally, these types of things that turned into our traditions today would be done. And likewise, a generation ago, our parents, we do things our parents did because it makes us feel comfortable, it makes us feel good. It's a very, very large cycle that in small forms and in larger forms and the overall form continues to just recycle itself. And that is the repeating of history in a sense, and it's the cycle of nature that repeats itself time and time again. It leads from birth to life to death to rebirth to life to death, and that is the cycle, I think.
Is there value, do you think, in still keeping these traditions alive, or has the whole occasion now become so bastardized and corrupted and has drifted so far from its roots so as to have no real value or meaning at all? Because the occasion of Christmas has been made materialistic, obviously. Loads of money gets spent at this time of year. People just put so much emphasis on buying shit, whether it's presents or food and drink, particularly in countries like the UK and the US, our countries. Do you feel there's any cultural value still in keeping these traditions alive?
Well, I think religion as a practice is a good parallel and example to the question that you just asked me. And this is something that I think I've come to terms with in the last year. I grew up religious, I grew up Christian, and I, at one point when I was a teenager, decided I don't think I want to be Christian anymore. I just know that people told me I was, so that's what I thought I was. And so I started looking into other religions. I thought maybe I'll convert to Judaism, maybe I'll be a Muslim, maybe I'll do, maybe I'll be a Buddhist. And then I realized one day I don't have to do any of these things. So I kind of went into a mindset that I'll be an atheist. And then I realized, well, I don't have to be that either. I could just take what makes sense to me and I can utilize it, and then that makes me a better person if I want to look at it that way. But that's the whole basis of religion. Religion is meant to provide people with a moral guideline so that they can have a better understanding, a happier life, all of these things. But that doesn't mean that religion hasn't been co-opted, it hasn't been abused, it hasn't been hijacked and used for other nefarious, malicious purposes. In the same way with these traditions, they provide us with the ability to connect with our ancestors. They provide us with the ability to connect with nature. That's kind of the whole purpose of these traditions. It makes us feel instinctually warm and protected and safe. But they've also, just like religion in general, to use a generalized word like religion, it encompasses everything, including atheism for that matter. They can also be hijacked, and they can be used for nefarious, malicious, or just unsavory practices. And we see that with Christmas in particular. We see that with maybe Easter even more so. We see that with Halloween, although Halloween's always kind of been a very economics-based holy day or holiday. Christmas hasn't always been that way, in my view, but I'm also very young. I think to answer your question, though, very simply, yes, there is value in it, but I think the value comes from how we individually derive it, not how we derive it as a culture, considering that we put so much focus on the economic value of it. But I don't think we should dismiss it entirely.
Now, as well as Christmas, around the same time of year, there's these two traditions known as Hanukkah, first off, which seems to be connected to the Jewish religion. And then we've got Kwanzaa, which takes place from what we refer to as Boxing Day in the UK, 26th of December through into January. What's the deal with these two? Have you researched these two customs? And it seems that they are based around Christmas, and they're like an offering to people from different cultures and different religions so that they can feel a part of things at this time of year as well. But they seem to be more structured towards their individual cultures and religious belief systems.
Yeah, it's kind of like Hanukkah, for example, is obviously a Jewish festival, and from what I remember, it's supposed to commemorate the rebuilding or the rededication or something like that of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The one thing I always remembered about Hanukkah was that Hanukkah is called the Festival of Lights, and so lights, again, burning the candles, that comes back into the narrative of the pagan Christmas, if you will. Yule logs, Christmas lights, fires, and things like that. It's the Festival of Lights. Kwanzaa, I never really researched that much. I just know that Kwanzaa has like 7 core principles, and Kwanzaa in that capacity, just from thinking off the top of my head. That reminds me, in Mithraism, for example, and a number of other religions and archetypes, mythologically speaking, the number 7 comes up time and time again, relating to the divine rays of creation, and those divine rays of creation that emanate from a central source. Basically, they're like the emissaries of God, or the angels of God, or the creators of the world. Those 7 core principles, those 7 divine lights, are much like the lights, the festival of lights of Hanukkah, much like the Yule log. Everything goes back to lights and warmth. And if we didn't have that light and we didn't have that warmth, we would die. And I think it's as simple as that. The instinct is there. It's embedded in us. It's genetic. And that's why we do these things. We don't even necessarily know why we do them, but it's all there.
I've just looked up Hanika and Kwanzaa on Quora, that site, Quora.com. Assuming this first answer is reliable and has validity, somebody says, it is a coincidence that Hanukkah and Christmas fall around the same time this year, and they do not always do so. In fact, in 2013, Hanukkah coincided with Thanksgiving. It's not a coincidence that Kwanzaa and Christmas are the same time of year, with Kwanzaa being a relatively recently created holiday. It was invented in the 1960s and designed originally as an alternative to Christmas. So that's what this individual says about it.
Isn't that like, it's African, isn't it?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, that's why I don't think I've ever really researched that much.
It's a black people's tradition, basically, so they can feel a part of things, I guess.
Although it sounds Jewish. Kwanzaa kind of sounds like a Hanukkah.
Yeah, it does, yeah. So around this time of year, there's always a couple of particular rap records that I pull out and put onto my podcasts. And I want to go into the lyrical content of these. I mean, isn't it amazing that you can still get hip-hop records that convey meaningful messages? It's obviously not the sort of stuff you hear on the radio. It's not the sort of stuff you hear ringing off down the club. It's not all the garbage that ties into the satanic agendas that you often discuss on your shows and the likes of Vigilant Citizen get into and stuff. You've got to hunt really vigilantly to find all this stuff. But there are a couple of records that really do blow your mind when you get into the lyrics, and they discuss what we're talking about on this show, the pagan origins of the occasion of Christmas. So there's one by Rask Kass, which is called Jack Frost 2, and I'll go into that shortly. But this first one is by a conscious hip-hop artist by the name of Beast 1333.
Oh, yeah, I know that one. I like that.
Yeah, he's a lyrical beast. And this record is called A Christmas Story. I just want to go into some of the lyrics here, and then I'll get you to pick up on what was said. So as part of the first verse, he talks about sacred oaks for the Germanic people. Trees took on new forms, adorn the evergreen, the representation of all fertility. Kris Kringle's supernatural gift-giving abilities, a poppycock. Good is left inside a pagan bloody sock. And then a bit later on, he talks about the seduction of the church, gradually the customs adopted, honouring Saturn. Everything Julius I concocted was to make it as painless as possible for the heathens, pagan Romans, who celebrate solstices and the seasons, would adapt to Christianity, went down without a hitch, proclaimed the same feast on the same day, so people didn't bitch, they had to switch, but they kept tradition same, so shit was cool. The wheel, pagan symbol for sun, the words Yule. Mistletoe was also considered a sacred plant, the unconquerable birth of the sun. And then a little bit further on, it was Wotan who flew in the sky before Saint Nick. It was Odin. His 8-legged horse name was Sleipnir. And that's how they came up with Santa and reindeer. He's the Celtic Holly King. In a sleigh he sees down, robes traditionally red. I mean, there's lots more, but we'll leave it there. So he's addressing some of the things that we've talked about already, and a whole lot more besides. Maybe we should pick up on the bit where he addresses Saturnalia, first of all, this Roman festival, which took place around this time, the Winter Solstice, but seems to be all about venerating the planet Saturn as part of that particular tradition. I know there's a lot there, but maybe you just want to pick up on some of the things that were said in those lyrics.
Yeah, well, first of all, that's one of my favorite songs to play around this time of the year. It's so jam-packed with information. I've listened to that a couple of years, but I was thinking, you mentioned Julius, because it was Pope Julius the First that declared December 25th to be the day that Christmas was celebrated. I know the Church of Jerusalem didn't officially celebrate Christmas until like the 7th century or something like that. There obviously are different, dates provided for when this change happened. I don't think it was as black and white, but when you look at the origins of something like Saturnalia, a lot of people obviously get really scared, and they think, well, that's Saturn, that's Satan, they're devil worshippers. And, Mark, in a way, yeah, and in a way, no. It's a little more complex than that. So Saturnalia is a Roman tradition, and obviously it's named after Saturn, but Saturn is the god of agriculture, just like the Celtic holly king, the green god, the green man, Osiris in Egypt. And so Saturn, being the god of agriculture, carries a scythe to cut down the crops in the same way that Saturn plants in us, as agricultural deity, the seeds of our destruction. At our birth, we inevitably will die. And when it's our time to die, the Grim Reaper comes and cuts us down like the crop. The Grim Reaper has the scythe. The Grim Reaper is Saturn, the god, the lord of time. Now, Saturn is also, in a sense, the inverter. Satan is the perverter, like the demon Valak, the defiler. And therefore, things are turned upside down. The sun, rather than being high in the sky, is low in the sky. In fact, it sinks from the northern hemisphere into the lower portion of the sky, and obviously we have, winter as we know it as a result. There's a tradition in Saturnalia called the Lords of Misrule, which relates, of course, to the influence of Saturn. And the Lords of Misrule is a tradition, and I've read numerous things on this, Mark. I'm not exactly sure how exactly this took place, but I've read a couple of history books where they were talking about the Lords of Misrule, a part of Saturnalia. It was a tradition, along with Saturnalia celebrations of drinking and being merry and feasting, but maybe it was a symbolic gesture more than anything. People that were, they worked in the homes of wealthy people, kind of like slaves, but maybe not like the slaves we think of when we think of that word. They would be granted the prestige of ownership for a period of time, and the wealthy people would be demoted, in a sense, to being very poor. And so they would switch positions. They would be inverted, the social classes. And that idea, Lords of Misrule, it comes from the idea of Saturn, the inverter or the perverter. In that song, he also mentioned the unconquered sun. Well, the unconquered sun, something you actually mentioned earlier, which is Mithra, the Persian god, or in Rome, Mithra was known as Mithras, who the Roman soldiers took a liking to Mithras, also known as Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Therefore, the 25th of December was also referred to as the birthday of the unconquered sun, and the merging of God's sun, the Son of God, and the celestial sun, so S-O-N-S-U-N. And it was the Son of God, the S-U-N, and all the things we talked about earlier, Mark, with attempting to come into balance with nature and understand things, both myth and science, observation, understanding, and acting these things out, like the rotation of the planets and performing, certain types of rituals during this time of the year, or any time of the year, any holiday. And those traditions are merged with the more modern traditions, let's call them. And when Pope Julius I declared this to be the permanent celebration of Christmas, well, just like in the song, it was basically to make the transition between the religion of the country people into the religion of the state more easy, more accessible for every person. It basically was a way to, I don't know how malicious it was, but to manipulate the masses of people rather than going and killing people and saying, you don't agree with us, we're going to kill you, we're excommunicating you. Well, you can still celebrate what you're going to celebrate. We're just going to redefine it. Now we're in control of it because we've redefined the language, and that's basically what the church did.
Yeah. And Santa Claus turns out to be an anagram of Satan Claus, or Santa, the Satan bit. That won't be a coincidence, I would imagine.
No, not at all, because again, inversion, Lords of Misrule, the Misrule during this time of the year, this is when darkness takes over. So of course they're going to honor the Lord of Chaos, the Lord of Misrule, the Lord of Darkness and Death, but it's not necessarily an honoring. I think a lot of people misunderstand this, and as much as some people might be afraid of Anton LaVey, for example, Anton LaVey also said this. He said, we don't use these symbols because we want to die, we worship death. We use the symbols because they're reminders that death can come at any time. And that's actually a very Masonic principle, that death can come at any time, and thus we should appreciate and enjoy life. Now, that's not to say that there aren't cultures and people that worship evil deities, but traditionally the reason that they've worshipped those evil deities, there's a really great book on this called The History of the Devil and the Idea of Evil by Paul Karras, where he traces all of these ideas and origins for evil back to these ancient cultures where it's not that they were evil, that they were killing kids and that they wanted blood sacrifice. People did that, but the reason that they were so hell-bent, no pun intended, on worshiping evil was because the evil things were those things to be feared, and the good God was a good God. So there's no reason to necessarily appease the good God. They're appeasing the things that are dark. They're appeasing the things that can hurt them. And that is, I think, part of the transformation and the unfolding of all of the traditions we have today. Because of darkness and because of coldness, we have fire, which brings us light and warmth and that feeling of protection again, and venerating nature. And, of course, Saturn, Satan, the god of the material world, the Ta in Egypt. Ta was the god who created the world on a potter's wheel out of clay. It's like Adam was created out of clay, breathed into the nostrils. We have the creation of the physical world, and that's basically not the movie, but the movie does come into play here, of the matrix, the womb, the earth, where we are all born out of, like leaves on the branches of a tree. Now, if you look at the movie The Matrix, the same archetype is there, because the architect of the Matrix is this guy with a white beard, and he created the physical world that most people know. And so in that same context, you look at Santa Claus, Satan, Saturn, Santa Claus, he wears those red robes, and he has, which is similar, you mentioned to Odin with his 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. You have the 8 horses of or the 8 reindeer of Santa. You have the red robe. Odin lived in the north, so Santa lives at the North Pole, and Santa has a white beard. Santa is, in a sense, a manifestation of the archetype of the architect, and that's why we call Saturn. Saturn is the architect. He is the creator, the manifester of the material world, and so all of this is focused on Saturn, and everything I just explained are just different points of view on why these things are, why these rituals or why these traditions are held. It's just not so black and white. It's not like, well, they had a Saturnalia celebration because they worshipped evil. Well, it's not that simple. It's a little more complex than that. But Mark, I think that when you understand the complexity, then it becomes more simple to comprehend why these things were done, and you realize that it's not one thing or another. There's a whole list of things, and we could sit here all night and just continue to go on and on and never come to a complete understanding of where every little detail of our tradition comes from. We can maybe get close, but there are so many little details and so many things that I think we'll never probably figure out. But we have an idea, and that idea leads us to information, which leads us to better understanding, and perhaps, in my view, more appreciation for the things that we do without otherwise even thinking about why we do them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's quite symbolic to what we're talking about here, the fact that I'm sat here in my man cave where I record all my radio shows. It's like a, outhouse conservatory on the side of the house. We started recording this at 4 p.m. UK time. I know it's earlier in the day for you, but at 4 p.m. here, it was pitch black already. So you feel like you only get half a day at this time of year, and it's bloody freezing as well. I've just had to put the heating on. So it's a little reminder of the death of the sun symbolically, and the celebration of the rebirth of it on the 25th of December, because these ancient cultures, you made a reference earlier to how difficult it was to get through these winter months when you had to rely on food that you'd harvested in the spring and summer months, lasting throughout the whole season. And it was cold, it got dark early, a lot of the plant life had died. It's just a reminder of the challenges that are brought at this time of year. Here I am sat in the pitch black, and I'm not a fan of winter. I really don't enjoy this time of year. I look forward to the spring. I love the longer nights and the warmer days, and the reappearance of the sun just for more hours in the day. And I think that's probably the case for most people. So just a little reminder of that as I'm sat here. And you were talking there about Santa Claus, Father Christmas with his white beard. And that's another play out of the archetype of the Grim Reaper, isn't it? Chronos.
Yes, absolutely.
The bringer of time, because death occurs because of the passage of time. If linear time did not occur, there would be no death. So you've got a couple of representations of the same archetype there, I think. The Grim Reaper and Chronos connected to time, and Santa Claus with the white beard.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the Grim Reaper, Father Time, Father Christmas. Of course, you have some people that don't like that terminology. It should be Mother Christmas now, Mark, not Father Christmas.
Jesus, let's not start on that.
But yes, Father Christmas, the Grim Reaper, the long white beard. As I said, Odin lives in the north, Santa lives in the north. There are a number. It's really actually it was kind of confusing for me when I first started researching all this, but there are so many different variations of Santa Claus. There's the Father Christmas, which is an English version, known as Sinter Klaas or Saint Nicholas. Based on Saint Nicholas. The Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Austria, Santa was Sankt Nicolaas, spelled a little bit differently, but it's basically the same principle. It's the same idea. I also think what you just described, and I feel the same way. I don't like the darkness as much. I really just dislike the cold. But when it comes to what you just described, you literally, I think, just described, I'm not sure if you intended to do it, you just described the reason why we celebrate all of these traditions today. Because what you just described, we live in a more modern world. You can turn on the heater. Well, 1,000 years ago, even a few hundred years ago, you couldn't just turn on the heater,
Sure.
So you had to find other ways to become warm, become safe. You didn't live in the same kind of environment, so you would look for things that would make it easier for you to do that. And what you described today is exactly, I imagine, in part, what people were probably thinking 100, 200, or 1,000 years ago, thinking the exact same thing, and how to find, some kind of balance and some kind of understanding and some kind of protection from those types of things.
I think it was probably a case of just enduring the hardship of the winter months and the promise of spring being just around the corner, and the rebirth of everything is the only thing that kept these people going, knowing that nature would return to that state. If it was a perennial winter and things never improved, I don't think there'd be a lot of reason to want to continue living in those conditions.
Precisely. Yep, absolutely. Because you're looking forward to the rebirth of the sun. I'm looking forward to it. A lot of people are probably looking forward to the spring into the summer, even though we're just really beginning winter in the northern hemisphere. And when you think that way today, and it's very primal, people 1,000 years ago thought the exact same thing. And I was also looking at these lyrics here from that song you mentioned by Beast 1333, and the next the hook of the next verse, I think it is, says, "Throughout hundreds of generations, tradition passed on, and now the holiday is a retail phenomena. You spend and spend and all to make the ones you love happy. It's the biggest holiday they have for sheep. They chose the winter solstice as the birth of Jesus Christ, the Savior, the Son of Man, the righteousness, the light." It's, again, a festival of lights like Hanukkah is. It's all based on the same exact principles. No matter what tradition you look at, you're going to find the same basic understanding that is very primal. It's very instinctual, and it's very much what you just described, all based on this idea of waiting for the sun to return. And that's what we're doing. We're waiting for Jesus to return in the heavens and to bring salvation to all of us. Well, according to this guy, sheep.
I went on a family visit to Lapland a few years ago, around about this time of year. Took the family up there. My daughters were both very young. And we got a day trip to Lapland, which is northern Finland. So it's just inside the Arctic Circle. And it was just a little reminder of what life would have been like for the people of Northern Europe in ancient times, because we went outside of this. There's this complex you go to. It's called Santa's World or something like that. But you can go outside and you can get reindeer rides, and you have huskies. And it was 2:00 in the afternoon, and it was absolutely pitch black. You'd swear it was the middle of the night. It was snowing. It was just very grim, the outside situation there. And it really brought to mind to me how difficult it would have been at that time of year for people, without the modern luxuries that we now have. Anyway, I just want to get into the lyrics of this next rap record, which I always play at this time of year. This comes from Rask Kass, who's an incredible dude, and he's a bit of an enigma because in a lot of his records, he comes with slack lyrics. He'll be talking about banging hoes and slinging crack and all of this. And yet, every now and again, he comes with an absolute mind blower, which confirms to you that he's obviously very well read, very intelligent, and very switched on and is paying attention to things. So I don't know why he feels the need to put out all this slack material in between the conscious stuff. Maybe it's fulfilling his obligation to his record company. Maybe he's required to put out stuff like that. I don't know. But this one particular song, Jack Frost 2, White Christmas, came out a few years ago. I'll just read the start of the lyrics here, and then we can comment on some of these. He starts by saying, "Snow in Bethlehem is rare as fuck. Ain't no evergreens and reindeer, Yule is nuts. The history of Christmas is a mix of customs from pagans, Yule clowns just decorating Satan. The Yule tree was first decorated in the 16th century in Livonia in Germany. In Northern Europe, the Druids during winter nights kept evergreens as a symbol of everlasting life. Vikings in Scandinavia went a little farther, thought of the special plant of the sun, got bolder. The Germanic tribes worshipped Amerigo, a flying white horse. Original Santa Claus rode one, of course, and the Dutch called him Sinter Klaas. His sidekick, a demon called the Krampus, bad children killer dog. Sinterklaas myth combined with Saint Nick." So he's going there into some of the stuff that you just mentioned about the Dutch tradition of Sinterklaas, Saint Nick, and a whole load of other stuff as well. And like I say, he's a guy that knows his stuff and is obviously very well researched in these areas.
I've always loved hip-hop music. I love rap music, and I've always loved to find, gems like that where the song is really powerful. And you get those from some rappers that you've heard of and some people you've never heard of. There's a guy named Vinny Paz from Philadelphia, and he's done a couple of really excellent songs about basically the origins of the traditions and the history of the last few hundred years in Western civilization, the origins of like the world wars and things like that. It's all in a song, and every line is really powerful, like this song that you're talking about here. You mentioned Balder, right? And Balder, we know the Romans would use, for the Saturnalia celebration, they used holly. They also used mistletoe, which is a parasitic plant. And in Norse mythology, mistletoe was responsible for the death of Balder, who's the son of Odin, and Balder is Balder's the son of Odin. Odin's the god of the summer sun, so Letha, the summer solstice. I read a mythology book. I just pulled up the quote from it here. Just randomly one day I was flipping through a mythology book, and I came across this when I was researching a little bit about Christmas. And this is what the book says, World Mythology, Donna Rosenberg. It says, Balder is one of a number of fertility gods in various mythologies who are killed, go down to the underworld, and then come back to life. The pattern of life, death, and resurrection reflects the annual cyclical pattern in nature of birth, spring, maturity, summer, death, autumn and winter, and rebirth the following spring, quote unquote. That is basically, I think, a summary of everything we've thus discussed tonight and everything we probably will continue to discuss throughout the rest of the broadcast. Balder, much like Amaterasu in Egypt, much like Jesus, all of these entities, deities, characters, archetypes, whatever you want to call them, play out the same way in every single mythological story, because these stories are anthropomorphized characteristics that are given to things that happen in nature. Balder is probably not a real person who lived a few thousand years ago and went to the underworld and came back to life, obviously. Balder is a representation of the sun, and being the son of Odin, another god of the sun, Balder is a representation of the sun in the same way that Horus, the son of Osiris, is a representation of the sun. And Horus, from where we get horizon, where the sun rises and where the sun sets. Of course, you might know Set is the evil god in Egypt, one of them, and that's where the sun sets, where the darkness comes about, and we have nighttime. And that's the cycle of each day, much like the cycle of the winter and then the summer. And we have this low point and this high point. We have a low point with night, and then we have a high point with day. So the seasons are essentially recycled every single day, every single week, every single month, every single year, and it's part of a much, much larger cycle overall. So when you look at something like Balder going to the underworld, you look at Amaterasu, which is a story I love. I think it's like 8,000 years old, too, in Japan. Really, really ancient story. She goes into the cave for 3 days and then is resurrected. Well, the whole idea of the resurrection, or the idea of the birth of the sun, the unconquered sun, the birth of the sun, is that on December 25th, the sun is born. And so, at least according to astrological researchers and people like a friend of mine, Jordan Maxwell, who really, I think, popularized this more than anybody, his work was the basis for that movie Zeitgeist that people just ruthlessly attack. But if you look at the astrology, or I should say the astronomy, but they are one and the same, I think, you notice that the sun sinks into the earth, and in a sense it stops moving for a day or two during this winter solstice, and then it starts to move northward again in its ascension to where it will eventually be the summer solstice. And when it starts to move north again, that's the birth of the sun, and the sun comes out of the tomb, out of the cave, out of the grotto, and is born and rises up into heaven. That is the whole story of Jesus after 3 days being resurrected and then ascending into heaven. And so, in the same way that we practice these traditions, there's a great misunderstanding, Mark, that my show's called The Secret Teachings. Sometimes people say, well, if they're secret, how do you know them? And I say, well, it's not really a secret. The show's just named after a book by Manly Palmer Hall called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And in that book, along with a number of other books on similar subjects, from mythology to occultism to magic, whatever it might be, is explain the same kind of traditional process by which, in order to understand this transition of the sun moving through the various cycles that it does, and then being born again on December 25th, roughly, people would undergo a similar process of what we call initiation into the mysteries of Greece or Egypt. And so what they would do is they would enter, in a simple form, they would enter the temple from the west, and then they would go into a sarcophagi, they'd go into a tomb, into a cave, and they would lay there for 3 days. And often what would happen is that they would prescribe, they usually had a woman in a certain, I think it was like in a red robe. They called it a raitu in some places, which means it's basically a ritual robe, a red robe, the lady in red, and she would administer this sacred drink. So contrary to popular belief, women were very much a part of these so-called men's orders that we call them today. Women were the central part, and she had the most important job. She would administer the drink that would create a state of almost like paralysis. And it was scary because you might not wake up, and that's the whole point. You experience death, you are then reborn, and then you are risen out of the tomb, and you exit the temple through the east, and you meet the rising sun in the east. So no longer are you a son or a daughter of man or woman, you become a son of God. You become an initiate into the mysteries, and that means that you now have information that allows you to understand what all of this stuff means, as opposed to just the basic story of, well, Balder went down to the underworld. No, now you are Balder. You went to the underworld. You died. You were resurrected. You met the setting sun, or the rising sun, rather, and now you are a son of God. You reenact the story of Jesus. You reenact the story of Balder, of Amaterasu. That's what this is all about, Mark.
Yeah. You brought in the archetype of Jesus there, Christ, from which we get the word Christmas. And as you mentioned in the movie Zeitgeist, it draws parallels between the figure of Jesus and all these other figures from ancient traditions, such as Mithra and Horus and so many others. And you see that it's the same story being symbolically retold to different cultures. But this brings in another aspect of what's being symbolized with the whole occasion of Christmas. And this is something that my friend Charlie Freak talks about often on his Freak Sense TV YouTube channel. And Santos Bonacci has spoken much about this as well. And it's this internal alchemical process that takes place within all humans, or has the potential to take place if we embrace it. It's known as the raising of the Chrism oil, and it's this process that takes place roughly every month, where you have this fluid, this oil, which rises up from the sacrum chakra and goes all the way up the spine, up the 33 vertebrae, into the human brain. And basically, this process involves the fluid going into this section of the human brain known as the claustrum, from which we get Santa Claus. And when it's completed, it goes into the pineal gland and illuminates it and remains there for 3 days. So there's all kinds of symbolism going on here connected to the myths surrounding Christmas. Are you familiar with this whole concept of the raising of the chrism oil, this internal alchemical process that's referred to here? Because it certainly seems to encode many aspects of what we're taught about Christmas, and particularly Santa Claus coming down the chimney and leaving these great gifts to humanity.
I actually don't know anything about that in terms of what you just described, but in terms of something being anointed with oil, I do know that we know Jesus Christ as the Messiah, or Yeshua, and that's just a title, of course. But in Egypt, the pharaohs were anointed with the fat from a crocodile, which was basically they got oil out of it, and the fat from the crocodile was called the Messa. And so that's where we get Messiah. It means the anointed one. I think D.M. Murdoch, who wrote The Christ Conspiracy, she talked about that. I interviewed her. I usually play the show on Christmas every year, several years ago before she passed away. That's an excellent book, too, The Christ Conspiracy, and it really goes into details about a lot of what we're talking about here. But back to what you're saying, I didn't know that. I've never heard that before, but it does, from what you just explained, absolutely parallel everything that we've discussed so far. And that's what you'll find. I mean, you could read mythology in Greece, you could read mythology in Japan. I'm sure there are some parts of the world that I've never even considered, and they have myths that are going to probably be exactly the same, because people are seeing the same exact things, and that same instinct that you have, that you just want to see the sun again, is the same instinct our ancestors had thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Charlie Freak did a great job of breaking it down on a show that I did with him this time last year. So I'll put the link in the show notes to that particular show if people want to go back and listen to Charlie breaking it down much better than I can. And Santos Bonacci does a great job of talking about all of this as well. Also in the show notes, I'll put the YouTube links to the Rask Kass and the Beast 1333 songs. So if people want to take a listen to those, I'll try and find the lyric videos as well, so you can really get inside the lyrical content of those songs and see what they're talking about. So just when you think you've got it all nailed and you realize that Christmas is a combination of all these pagan traditions, it incorporates Saturnalia, it incorporates the Winter Solstice, there seem to be elements of this internal alchemical process, the raising of the chrism oil, that takes place within humans once a month for a 3-day period. You think you've got all this symbolism nailed. You realize that the tradition of Christmas and all its different archetypes and symbols goes even further, because there's another aspect of it which has been brought to my attention when you look at the figure of Santa Claus, Father Christmas, with his red and white coat. It also seems to be a representation of psilocybin or magic mushrooms, a particular breed of them from certain European cultures, which were red with white spots. And the cultures of ancient times would ingest these mushrooms as a type of plant medicine, and they would use them as psychedelics, or what's been referred to as entheogens, and raise their consciousness and just undergo these altered states as a result of the effect that these mushrooms would have on them. And these mushrooms would grow in the forests of certain parts of Northern Europe. So we've now got another symbolic depiction of what Christmas is all about, and particularly the figure of Father Christmas or Santa Claus, when you factor in these particular mushrooms. Is that an aspect that's come across your radar and your research as well here, Ryan?
Not anything I've documented in my book, Occult Arcana, which has all this information in it, but when you said that, I remembered that I heard that somewhere, and then I also thought, that's, if I remember this correctly, that's also the type of mushroom that is used in Alice in Wonderland, the red mushroom with the white spots.
I think it is, yeah.
And obviously that movie itself is very trippy, the various forms of that movie, but the whole storyline that talks about, basically the upside down, going through the mirror, and these are actually, I don't want to get sidetracked, but those are also things that we see all throughout the entertainment industry, looking into the mirror and transforming oneself through the mirror, being demonically possessed. being out of one's mind, moving into a parallel world. You see that in everything from the music of Eminem to TV shows like Black Mirror. Anyway, the whole point, though, is, yes, it's like a psychedelic experience. I'm trying to think of where I heard that, though. What you said about Santa's robes is what rang a bell to me. I don't know if I have any other additional comments on it, but now you just got me thinking. I've definitely heard that somewhere, so that's not the first time I've heard it.
And the idea behind the ingestion of these mushrooms and the altered states of consciousness that people would undergo as a result, and also this internal alchemical process, the raising of the chrism oil. Charlie Freak talks about how the pineal gland would be illuminated as a result of this process, and you would come to meet God face to face. You know, that's the language he uses. Basically, you're embracing this higher self that dwells within you, your connection back to divinity, back to source. And these two processes are said to enable you to achieve that, the ingesting of the mushrooms and the raising of the chrism oil. And the idea here is the bringing of great gifts. These are the greatest gifts that humanity can undergo from a conscious point of view. And so again, we're back to the idea at Christmas of the giving of gifts and the being the kindness that people embrace towards each other. It's the same archetypes, it's the same ideas that are woven into these customs. And they've got all these different sources and all these different inspirations. But it all comes back to the way we started the show, really, talking about these strange rituals that we all undergo this time of year and take part in without really understanding what they mean. But the archetypes are there at the genetic core of we as human beings, I guess.
Yeah, there's everything that you just summed up there. Again, I've not researched a lot about it, but it does absolutely parallel everything I have researched and everything that we've discussed tonight. The idea of a gift, though, giving gifts, was a practice in Rome during the Saturnalia celebration. But the idea of giving a gift, we are gifted with life, we are gifted with warmth, we are gifted with protection, all of these things from the sun, the savior of mankind. And then, of course, you have other characters that are actual historical characters, like Nicholas of Myra is a 4th century Christian saint and a Greek bishop. I think in what today is now Turkey, he was known as Nicholas the Wonder Worker, and he would give gifts, usually in secret. Didn't let people know. He would just basically provide people with gifts and just leave things for them without recognition. And one of the things he did was put coins in shoes. We know about, like, you place your socks over the fireplace, stockings. You'd have wet socks. You place them over the fireplace to dry. And that became a really popular symbol in the gift-giving process because coins were placed into shoes, into socks, and we put gifts into those socks over the fireplace drying. The gifts that were given by Nicholas the Wonder Worker, for example, are kind of similar to blessings. You might have heard of the blessings of Ishtar, who would give a blessing when, during the celebration of Ostara, as we know it, Easter, Ishtar. The idea is that during this time of the year, springtime, Eostra, which is European, but Ishtar, which is Babylonian, Ishtar would descend from the heavens in an egg, and then whoever could find the egg would be rewarded with a blessing from the goddess. Now that, of course, sounds like Easter egg hunting. And also, on a side note, just to put a little sticky note in this conversation, you see this manifested in the entertainment industry. Several years ago, it was Lady Gaga, Ra, Ma, Gaga, father, mother, child, fire, water, third part, earth, baby. And she came to one of the music awards in a giant egg. She personifies this archetype, Lady Gaga does. But there's also the famous blessings of Bridget, the blessings of the goddess Bridget, or the blessings of any god, or any goddess for that matter, the blessings of the sun, the gift to us of life. All of that relates to the gifts that are given on Christmas. I mean, although these aren't really tangible gifts, they symbolize, they symbolize the intent of I would say the intent of the gods in a sense. but the gods are also manifestations of us. But the blessings that we are given are then manifested through the personal physical gifts that we give. So those gifts are really just symbolic of the blessings of the sun, the blessings of nature, if you will. And all of that, whether it's the sock over the fireplace or it's the gift of life, all of that is directly related to our Christmas celebration and why we do the things we do. I know some people get upset about it, Mark, but I just think it's kind of cool. Like, why do we hang giant socks over a fireplace? Well, obviously, at one point, we hung wet socks over a fireplace to dry. Somebody made a tradition of putting some type of coin in them or gift in them, and that tradition became what it is today. And then it's been commercialized, of course, but the origin of that tradition makes a little bit of sense, and I think that's just really interesting to find out where things come from.
Yeah. Nobody can answer the question as to why it is every time you go in a goddamn supermarket this time of year, you hear Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You. or here in Britain, you have to hear Slade, or the Pogues and Kirsty MacColl, or Shakin' Bloody Stevens for another year. Nobody can answer why we go through that ritual every year. But trust me, it's very, very real. And any DJ knows very well that you cannot do a gig at this time of year without drunken women coming up to the booth insisting you play Mariah Carey 17 times during the goddamn night. That's just a little rant there. So I think the next thing we may do is Secret Teachings of Easter, by the sounds of it, because that occasion seems to have as much, if not more, symbolism attached than Christmas does.
Yeah, it does. I don't know if I'd say more, but at least equal. I mean, the origins of Easter, when I researched that, see what I did was I wrote a book called Occult Arcana, which is like 500 pages, 7 by 9. The text is relatively smaller, so it's just so much information. Everything we've discussed tonight is literally from a tiny section in one chapter. So that's just on Christmas. If you look at Easter and the origins of Easter, I mean, it's the same kind of thing in terms of having different cultures where you're celebrating the rebirth, you're celebrating the resurrection, whether that's in the Middle East or that's in your part of the world today, what you call the UK. Every part of the world has that kind of celebration. I'm trying to think of what it was. I think it's called it's Nowrtz or something. Nortz. It means like New Year, and I think that's Middle Eastern. But it's a similar tradition. I think it was Babylonian, where it was a celebration of basically the rebirth or something to that effect. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But yes, to sum up that point, Easter definitely has a very long traditional history, just like Christmas. And, I mean, Halloween does too. Halloween's probably my favorite, holiday to break down. And then, you have a number of other holidays that we don't really think about. But, Valentine's Day, for example. Valentine's Day isn't necessarily built off of one of the sabbats, major or minor, on the witches' calendar, but we have Valentine's Day around mid-February. And Valentine's Day has a number of origins that relate back to Rome, of course, as most of the traditions that we have today do. And right before we celebrate Valentine's Day, there's a celebration called Imbolc, or Candlemas, or Bridget. It's the blessings of Bridget. Bridget blesses us with the first indication that the winter will soon be over and that spring is coming. So Imbolc is kind of like it's a predecessor to the spring equinox. It provides us with the notification that the winter is not going to last forever. And so people would light candles hoping to strengthen symbolically the sun so that the sun would eventually rise to full strength again during Litha. And we celebrate Valentine's Day right in the middle of that, just right after Imbolc. Without going into too many details, the whole idea is like a spiritual cleansing, a physical cleansing. So for the Imbolc celebration, we start to clean things out from the winter months, and that's our spring cleaning tradition that we have today. I mean, there are so many things, Mark. We just have these ideas because our parents did them, because we instinctually feel them. And it's not I just think it should be really emphasized. It's not a negative, it's not a demeaning, it's not an attack on someone's belief system to examine where the traditions come from. For example, if someone said to me, hey, where the celebration of Christmas came from, and they tell me the things that you told me or you told me tonight that I learned, and things I've told you, and the listeners have listened to and probably learned a few things, and they probably know things we don't know. I don't get upset at somebody for saying, "Hey, do you know where the tradition of the sock comes from?" Why? I don't know why people get upset about that. And I've experienced that my whole life, just being interested, learning where something comes from, and saying, "Hey, you know, Saturday's named after Saturn. Oh, that's evil. Don't talk about that." Well, it's not evil. It's just a fact. So that's just my little rant. That just kind of bothers me.
Sure. I don't want to go too far down this particular rabbit hole, but I think it's worth mentioning, just picking up on what you were saying there about Valentine's Day. I do recall that in 2012, we had the very strange death of Whitney Houston, which seemed to be steeped in ritual. I think from memory, it was the 11th of February when she turned up dead. And I remember it was just before Valentine's Day because her back catalogue, which mostly consisted of love songs, went through the roof and made an absolute fortune for a record company because everyone was going out buying these albums in commemoration of Whitney. But what you were saying there about Candlemas and Imbolc and this idea of ritual cleansing, spiritual cleansing, isn't it interesting that she turns up dead in a bathtub? And her daughter, Bobby Christina, had been discovered in a bathtub 24 hours before Whitney's body was found. We never really got a satisfactory explanation as to the way that Whitney died. It was all chalked up to some kind of loosely defined overdose. But the whole occasion was steeped in ritual. I know you've done shows about this before. And like I say, I don't want to go too far down this particular rabbit hole because we'll be here for another 2 hours. But since you brought it up, I think the case of Whitney Houston becomes very interesting to look at from a symbolic point of view when you consider the time of year and those customs that you just mentioned.
Yeah, certainly. I didn't even think of that, but you're absolutely right. And the nature of, to look at the bathtub briefly, the nature of the bathtub used by the music industry. Whether it's new artists like Poppy or I don't know how many times I've watched a music video and there's someone in a bathtub. Taylor Swift.
Oh, it's never ending.
It's never ending. Yeah, I mean it represents obviously cleansing and purity and things like that. But there are ideas that when you have reports of an overdose in the music industry that the person died but didn't actually die, they just kind of left the industry, but their image died. And there are some things that, maybe represent a cleansing in the sense of the bathtub, a cleansing of people that are no longer useful. And there are, whether or not, we believe it, there are those that believe that these points on the wheel of the year and being able to come into contact with the cycles of nature gives you power. It's not a bad thing, but some people will use it as a negative thing, and perhaps carry out a ritual, perhaps a ritual murder, during this time of the year because it suits the agenda of whatever they might be attempting to do. So in the case of the bathtub, that's a perfect way. Kill somebody, say it's an overdose, it's a ritual cleansing, they're no longer needed. And I don't know, that's just the first thing that comes to mind, but the whole month of February is a month for ritual cleansing. There's a Roman festival called Februalia, and it's held just like Christmas or just like with Halloween. It's held in order to purify homes of mischievous spirits, which are manifestations of just, the idea of negativity in the home. And so most of the homes were cleansed by sprinkling salt throughout the home, and then they'd sweep the salt out and push the energy out of the home. And it was sometime around, the midpoint of February, there's a 3-day observational period, a fertility festival known as Lupercalia, and that's what we now refer to as Valentine's Day. So there's a really, really interesting history for the month of February as well, and every other month and every other holiday or holy day, no matter how minor or how major.
No doubt. Well, great show, brother. Great show. For people who are hearing your stuff for the first time and going, who the hell is this guy? Where can we hear more? Tell them all about your show, The Secret Teachings, and where they can get more of this incredible information that you put out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for giving me the time to do that, Mark. Obviously, I love our conversations. You and I did an amazing show about a year and a half ago. 3 hours, you said probably one of the longest shows you've done, and we got into some incredible details about the music industry. That is one of my favorite subjects. That's one of the most requested subjects I get is the music industry, the entertainment industry. And I've been doing a lot of that recently, but I do a lot of other information as well. I do health. I break down ingredients. I break down an understanding of symbols in general, whether we look at holidays, holy days, we look at world events. I do a little bit of everything based in the nature of magic and an understanding of patterns and objective observation. And my show airs 5 nights a week, Monday through Friday. It's on the Fringe FM or the Fringe.fm. You can listen on TuneIn, TalkStream Live, the Paranormal Radio app, or just find me on the website that I run for my show. It's called www.thesecretteachings.info. And on that website, you'll find my archive. You'll find my 3 books that are published at the moment. And you'll find all of our show promos for each night of the week. My books, I have a book called Food Philosophy. I have a book called The Technological Elixir, which will also take you into the entertainment industry. And then my major book, Occult Arcana, as I mentioned. Everything we discussed tonight, most of it was from memory. I did pull my book up for a few references, but everything that we discussed was in a very small section of this book. So this book is 500-plus pages. It's 7 by 9, so it's much larger than a normal-sized book. And that's just a tiny little, maybe 2 pages of what we discussed tonight in 2 hours. That's how much info is in this book. That's the basis for everything that I do. It's called Occult Arcana. It's on the website at www.thesecretteachings.info. And if listeners would like to contact me, the email is rdgable, Romeo Delta, Gable, rdgable at yahoo.com or facebook.com/The Secret Teachings. Thank you so much, Mark.
This is just for Rob.
Vibrations, I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up vibrations.